Hi there, I'm Nafisa Latic, and today we look at a conflict happening outside the Balkans, which has captured the attention of the entire world. That's Palestinians under Israeli attack in Gaza and the West Bank. The violence has drawn a sharp reaction across the Balkans, and it's also revealing the region's divides. Take Bosnia and Herzegovina as an example. In one part of the country, there is a Palestinian flag flying from a historic bridge. In another, the Israeli flag is being projected onto a government building. In a tweet, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu thanked Bosnia for its support. But both Bosnia's foreign minister and the country's Bosniak leader were quick to say there is no such support for Israeli attacks on civilians. So how is this conflict really being viewed inside Bosnia? Semir Sejfovic is in Sarajevo to find out.
Sarajevo is often referred to as the Jerusalem of Europe. Bosnia and Herzegovina's capital is proud of its history and religious diversity. As the sun rises, these empty streets and mosques will soon be filled with thousands of Muslim worshippers heading to the Eid prayer, a Muslim holiday celebrated at the end of the holy month of Ramadan. Usually it is a festive and happy occasion, but this year the mood is different. The thoughts of worshippers are with the actual Jerusalem, thousands of kilometers away.
Mi smo ovdje radosni zbog Bajrama I Ramazana koja smo ispostavili, zaista smo tužni zbog tih takvih tragičnih situacija koje se dešavaju našoj braći muslimanima.
Scars of Bosnia's war in the 1990s are still visible throughout the city. Israel's occupation and attacks against Palestinians remind many in Sarajevo of their own brutal past.
Dakle, to se ponavlja u ciklusima I postepeno Izrael završava posao, nažalost, uz pomoć sila I vele sila. Na živom tijelu Palestine već 70-80 godina Izrael pravi državu I faktički otima zemlju.
While the public in the capital of Sarajevo expressed support for Palestine, it was quite a different picture and different story in the predominantly Serb-populated city of Banja Luka. There, an Israeli flag was displayed on a regional parliament building. During the Bosnian War, Israel armed Serb nationalist forces despite a UN-imposed weapons embargo. Later, the army of Republika Srpska, along with its leadership, were convicted and held accountable by the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia in The Hague for the Srebrenica genocide and crimes against humanity. To this day, the Bosnian Serb authorities continue to deny the Srebrenica genocide and openly celebrate convicted war criminals, and others who also deny the genocide, like controversial writer and Nobel Prize winner Peter Handke. Earlier this month, Republika Srpska's leaders awarded him the entity's highest honors.
I decided to come here. There were a strong wind against me to come, but I decided to come, and I'm quite nearly happy.
A za Banja Luku ovo je ponovo jedan dan u kome dočekujemo prijatelja, u kome dočekujemo čovjeka za kojeg gajimo najbolja osjećanja, zahvalnosti za sve što je učinio u svom životu I svom djelu.
While Palestine may seem a world away, the president of the Jewish community in Bosnia and Herzegovina warns of local far-right movements exploiting the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians for their own gains.
Na ovom zabranom globusu uvijek postoji neko žarište. Na Bliskom istoku je to dijelovi Izraela I Palestine. Bojim se da u Europi to ne postane Bosna I Hercegovina. Jer vidite šta se dešava od separatističkih težnji do određenih ekscesa koji se dešavaju širom svijeta, gdje jačanjem desničarskih pokreta razvijaju se takve radikalne grupe koje prijete svima nama.
Those raising voices in support of Palestine are wondering if anyone is listening and whether nationalists and the far right could become a threat to Bosnia and Herzegovina again. Semir Sejfovic, TRT World, Sarajevo.
My guest today is Daniel Jegic, and he joins me now from Beirut. He's a researcher and writer specializing in colonialism in Palestine. He also holds a PhD in American Studies. Thank you so much, Daniel, for coming in on Across the Balkans. I appreciate your time. Firstly, how would you characterize or explain what's happening right now in Gaza, occupied East Jerusalem, and across the West Bank?
What we see right now is a mere continuation of Israeli policies of violence that have been ongoing for at least 73 years. Currently, there is another surge of attacks on Gaza, where Palestinians have been living under a siege of Israel. And then, of course, there are uprisings all over 48 Palestine and the West Bank, as well as East Jerusalem. People are protesting against this structural racism that they have been confronted with for decades.
And what do you make of the international reaction to the violence so far? And specifically, what has been the reaction across the Balkans?
I mean, the international reaction is in some ways similar to the way it was in 2014 during the last Israeli war on Gaza. There is oftentimes a reframing by the international community, in particular by Western governments, of this settler colonial violence and indigenous resistance into an alleged diplomatic conflict. So what we hear these days, again, is a reinforcement of these tropes of a peace talks, two-state solution, and so on, and framing the current situation as a conflict or as a clash between two countries or between two different forces. And oftentimes this rhetoric reinforces the idea that there's a parity of power that there isn't. And it's very, very important to remember that Israel is a settler colonial project that was built on and in Palestine and not a sovereign state alongside it. Whereas the international reaction, even those that are sometimes more critical of Israeli actions are still perpetuating this narrative. And we've seen these reactions as well across the Balkans, in particular from the governments in the former Yugoslavia that have, to some extent, replicated this rather void language that had been employed by the EU. And the EU itself has now for decades has been issuing statements condemning violence, but really differentiating between aggressor and victim, and more or less stubbornly employing the same language of talks and negotiations and concepts that haven't worked or haven't been feasible for a while. And whereas this somehow reframes the issue, it also allows Israel to some extent to continue its aggressive policies. And then, of course, the reactions from within the countries in the former Yugoslavia, from an official side, have mostly been in line with these Western dynamics that we see.
Right. We've just seen a report by Semir about the divided reaction inside Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, what's behind the support and solidarity for Palestinians from Bosniaks, from Bosnian Muslims? And why do you think the attacks on Palestinians have sparked divisions between people in Bosnia particularly?
Very good question. I assume that many people do, maybe to some extent, identify with the Palestinian cause based on their own experiences of ethnic cleansing and genocide. But then, of course, others would contradict this statement. But there is, I mean, if we look back into history, there has been previously support for Palestine during the times of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia under the rule of Tito, who actually in '67 cut ties with Israel when it occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And so Yugoslavia back then did not have ties, diplomatic ties with Israel for over 2 decades. I think it's also important to look at that context. But generally, what we see is that there is a discrepancy between the solidarity. So there are people protesting in Sarajevo and Ljubljana, Pristina, and other cities throughout the Balkans, but that does not translate into the official policies, because effectively most of the governments obviously have economic and political ties with Israel. Israel is also a provider of military equipment, and from an official perspective, of course, Palestinian lives aren't a priority, even though there is solidarity in the population.
Right. Daniel, you know, the leader of Bosnia's Jewish community told to our correspondent that he's worried about the nationalists and the far-right movements somehow exploiting this conflict in a way that could pose a threat to peace in Bosnia too. How real are the concerns over nationalistic violence in Bosnia right now?
It's a good question. I think it's also important to keep in mind that the situation in Palestine has never been an ethnic or religious conflict, which is the way that it is sometimes unfortunately represented in the West. It is a struggle of a settler colonial movement and an indigenous population. But of course, it has been exploited from different sides. And in particular, if you look at right-wing extremism, particularly in Europe, there are different right-wing and far-right movements and extremists that actually support Israel, that somehow see Zionism and the racist ideology behind it as a successful model, the way it was implemented by Israel for policies of apartheid, of racist oppression, and so on. So in many ways, the situation in Palestine and Israel has worked as a way for people in other parts of the world for their identity making. But it needs to be seen whether how the situation will develop. But we'd also like to stress that Palestinians, Palestinian protesters, and civil society organizations have repeatedly stressed that their struggle is not against Jews, that their struggle is against the occupation and against the oppression, and it's a struggle for human rights and not for some ethnic or religious claims in particular.
So what should or can Balkan nations do to help end the violence in Palestine? I know these countries are poor and small, but can they have an impact? Can they at least spread a message?
Good question. I think, of course, I mean, when we see the protests that have been taking place in the Balkans, it shows that there is solidarity. However, still, I think from the official side, because many of these now smaller and less internationally less significant countries do oftentimes tie their foreign policy to that of the European Union or of the United States. So the question really is whether there is a will from official sides to promote a pro-Palestinian perspective, which seems rather unlikely. And as long as the United States and the European Union continue their current stance, I do not see how there could possibly be a shift in the official rhetoric amongst the governments in the former Yugoslavia.
And what lessons can be learned from the Balkans about holding states accountable for war crimes and the killing of civilians?
Good question. I mean, as we see even today, over 2 decades after the wars in the Balkans, there are still many issues that are unsolved. But of course, the difference here is that the wars in the Balkans were treated within the frameworks of international law and criminal justice to some extent. That, of course, is not the case in Palestine. Even what we see today, reports by human rights organizations on international law, on that there is an apartheid regime, that Israel is violating UN resolutions, are to some extent being ignored or even dismissed by Western governments. So even if there is this framework of international humanitarian law and justice, there are efforts to block that in Palestine to some extent. So even if there are lessons that are learned from Yugoslavia, we do not see the same approach toward Palestine, unfortunately.
Okay, Daniel, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate your insight for us here across the Balkans. Let's hope the situation in Palestine will de-escalate soon. Daniel is a researcher and writer specializing in colonialism in Palestine particularly. Thanks again. Plastic waste is one of the world's biggest environmental problems. Millions of tons are thrown away, and most countries are struggling to know what to do with it. In Serbia, only 27% of its plastic waste is recycled, and the rest ends up in landfills and rivers, which are some of the most polluted in Europe. Activists say the government has failed to protect the environment. So some are taking matters into their own hands. Katarina Petrovic is in Belgrade to meet one man on a mission to turn plastic waste into something useful.
Oh yeah, this one's much lighter. Yeah.
You get to keep this one.
Oh, thank you so much.
You can put it on your little shelf and you can say, oh, I have an eco block.
Plastic is nearly indestructible, and the world produces 1 million tons of it every day. Most ends up being thrown away. The environment cannot deal with its disposal fast enough to keep us from harm. But does plastic pollution have to be such an enormous problem? Or are there ways we could put it to use? Our consumption of plastic is out of control, and we've created huge quantities of plastic-based waste all over the world. But imagine if we were able to turn these growing wastelands into something that is useful to society. An emerging way for companies to combat waste is what is now referred to as the circular economy. And today I'm going to see how trash can be turned into something new right here in Belgrade. An environmental startup based in Germany has sent its trash collection boats to the Balkans to prevent waste from entering the sea. A Serbian company run by Australian Tony Lund is joining them on a mission to clean up and create building materials out of the plastic fished from the river. In Serbia, pollution has become political and protests are growing. Activists taking part in eco-uprising believe that the government isn't doing enough to fix the problem. In the meantime, Belgrade, a capital city where rivers Danube and Sava converge, loves its life on water, yet we keep throwing trash in it. But we're not beyond all hope just yet. Meet the people who are setting plastics on a new life cycle.
I became a mining engineer in Australia and I was very good at it and worked all over the world. So I've helped mining companies take the resources out of the world. Now I'm a little bit older, I feel that I should be paying something back to the world in general.
Thank you. Whoopla.
Whoops.
This is fun already.
Of course. About 3 years ago, I was sitting in the miner's raft over here, looking across at Adamajica, and I saw this house. This one, yeah.
This one here, the square one?
Yes.
Ah, but that's not yours.
That is mine. So we have a reverse osmosis system with a UV filter, so we can purify the water out of the river and take out all the bacteria and all the solids and have drinking water. If for any reason there's no water on the island, I've still got water as well as power. So in a nuclear catastrophe, I'm fine.
Good thinking. And what is the system actually around here for garbage?
Believe it or not, the people on the island in general have a really good social conscience. They take all the rubbish with them on the boats back over and put them in the mainland bins, but we've heard stories about people with the restaurants and stuff like that when they finish clearing up at the end of the evening and it's dark. Basically, some of that gets tossed in the river. Most of the restaurants don't have any form of fixing the stuff from the toilets and stuff, so like everything else in Belgrade, all the human waste ends up in the river as well.
The boats docking by the shore are natural collectors of the waste. Lined up on the Sava River just across from Adamajica Island, they're positioned on angles which funnel and trap the rubbish. What happens to all that trash that gets stuck in between the rafts? Like, does it just sit there, or the water washes it away?
In spring, people go and clean it off, and
so they do organize themselves to go
put it back in the river, and it floats down. So it doesn't leave the river; it just migrates itself down until it ends up against the hydro dams, because it can't get past the hydro dams, and that's where it gets fished out and then transported to landfill or whatever other disposable methods. That's why War Island has so much plastics and rubbish on it, because it's where the Danube and the Sava meet, so it's just a natural collection point down there.
And this is where we're going.
Yeah. Do you want to drive?
Yes. We're on our way to join the boat that's cleaning the river. It's stopped at a part of the island where a crew is collecting garbage washed ashore. They will load the boat with it before returning to the river. Just one little pocket in the river, and there's tons of garbage, and it just seems like, oh, okay, it's garbage that we're used to seeing. But try picking it up and try cleaning it up. It's a completely different story. That's when you realize that it's way too much waste. Some plastics can be recycled just as they are by shredding, melting and remolding them. This is what Tony's company and others like it are trying to do. They're breaking down plastic bottles, beer cans and Tetra Paks and turning them into eco-friendly composite boards and bricks. They're even planning to make boats out of recycled plastic.
So we're going to go through the process that we would do to make a plastic block from scratch. First we go and clean the bottle caps. And we have a shredder in here that we shred the plastic bottle caps. From there, we make a product that we can fit through the extruder, and then we put it through the extruder. So we'll let it cool down a little bit, and then we'll undo it, and you can have your very own recycled plastic building block. What we're trying to do is we're trying to find a way to take as much of the plastics that we're collecting from the environment and put it into material that is not going to go anywhere.
And what do you use this specifically for?
We can use it for walls, we can use it for roofs, we can use it for floors, we can use it for anything.
Oh, because this is plastic, would this be toxic to live in?
You drink out of these bottles and you put this material in your body.
As long as the temperature doesn't get above a certain point where the plastic gets damaged, then it will not be toxic.
And that's 190 degrees for the melting point, but for it to actually burn and give off nasty stuff, around 300 degrees C. So if you're in a building and it's 300 degrees inside, then I think you've got more things to worry about than the plastic that's going to melt. One of the things that I really like is boats, and we decided we're going to make high-density polyethylene boats. We joke about it that it's actually bulletproof, but they use high-density polyethylene in body armour in Russia, and it stops an AK-47 bullet over 2 metres. So in reality, the boats really are bulletproof if you have a certain thickness of high-density polyethylene. So plastic boats, the way of the future.
So we gather basically all the plastic bottle caps and all the plastic bottles and we make a boat.
Of course. Why not?
Wonderful. Plastic pollution seems inescapable. It's still unclear if the tides will turn and the will of the governments, people's mindsets and business opportunities for recycled plastic to replace conventional building materials. Companies like Tony's might not be able to clean the world's waters all by themselves, But at least for every plastic bottle they turn into a brick, it's one less that will remain out in nature.
Thanks for watching this episode of Across the Balkans, the show dedicated to the people, places, and perspectives from Southeastern Europe. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.